Allah is a murderer, and his Muslims are his weapons through which he kills. So if you keep on reading down in the very same surah that we were just looking at, Surah 8 of the Quran, you eventually realize that it continues the very same flow of thought as verse 12 that we just took apart. And unavoidably, you eventually run into verse 17, and everything you thought you knew about Islam is turned upside down, and your world is rocked by it. Quote, "You did not slay them, but Allah slew them." Close quote. So think about this for a second. Back in the previous section of this book, we just dissected verse 12 of this Surah 8. And if you remember correctly, Allah wanted to strike terror into the hearts of the non-Muslims, and he wanted to do so through his human instruments, his believers, his Muslims. They're the ones that carry out his plan, his bloodshed. He wanted to achieve this terror in the hearts of non-Muslims by having the Muslims smite the non-Muslims above their necks and chopping off the non-Muslims' fingers. All right? So now we're 5 verses later. The very same idea is developed, but it's developed further. It's developed deeper. A few sentences later, it gets uglier. According to the verse we just looked at, verse 17, even though the Muslims are the ones who are actually physically carrying out the killing, the one who's actually slaying or killing them, per this verse, is Allah himself. I don't care who you are, what seminar you've been to, in your heart, in the depth of your own conscience, you know that this is a wicked religion. It is wicked as hell. You're just confronted with a deity who commits acts of homicide and mutilation. Allah wants to force people to submit to him or accept his religion, which is Islam, by killing all who will not. And his followers, the Muslims, are the chosen vessels. They're the instruments through whom he wants to accomplish this horrible thing. Allah is the almighty puppeteer in the sky, and the Muslims are simply the puppets that he guides to carry out his will in this sick puppet show called human history on this stage called the earth. When he guides one of his puppets to act out what he's trying to achieve, he's let us know in this very verse that it's not the Muslim puppet that's responsible for the bloodshed and the carnage, but the puppet master himself, Allah, is the real murderer behind it all. I know this sounds horrible, I know it's hard to hear, but you got to understand, everyone on television and everyone on the radio and everyone in the media is defending this religion right now. Convert or we will kill you, rob your dead body, and then use the money in your pockets to fund the spread of Islam. Surah 8, verse 38, so we're continuing Surah 8 here. You can see the flow, you can see the theme of this surah. You hit verse 38, quote, "Say to the unbelievers, if they give over, he will forgive them what is past. But if they return, the wont of the ancients is already gone." Close quote. So breaking this thing down as we always do, say to the unbelievers, and again, unbelievers are non-Muslims in the context. So Muslims who study this verse are being instructed, being taught by Allah what to say to them when they run into them. If they give over, he will forgive them what is past. So if the non-Muslim will simply convert to Islam, Allah is going to forgive them for all the time prior to their conversion in the preceding years of their life in their past where they were not a Muslim. But the conjunction, the change-up, if they return, i.e. if they turn away from the offer of Islam and go back to stay stronger in the previous religion that they believed in before Islam was put in front of them, the wont of the ancients is already gone, i.e. the same things that have been done to non-Muslims in the past, in other centuries, should continue to be done to rejectors of Islam even now. So these verses never become outdated. The very next verse, verse 39, says, quote, "Fight them till there's no persecution, and the religion is Allah's entirely. Then if they give over, surely Allah sees the things they do." Close quote. So fight or kill them, and again, them is the non-Muslims, till there's no persecution. The idea is kill all non-Muslims until there are no competing religious worldviews anywhere to be seen. Muslim countries always see the spread of any other religion, philosophy, or idea than Islam in their country as a persecution against Islam. And the religion is Allah's entirely. So until Islam is the dominant religion across that land, that geographical location, all right, you got to keep killing until it's number one numerically. Then if they give over, in other words, after you've done enough killing, if the remaining people who've rejected convert to Islam by submitting to the pagan moon deity of Muhammad's Quraysh tribe, surely Allah sees the things they do. In other words, Allah will reward them for coming over to the quote-unquote truth of Islam. So if they receive an answer in the negative and a person will not convert to Islam, you can see they are to kill that person. But the next couple verses later, verse 41, you can see after that person is dead, the Muslim is supposed to go through that dead person's pockets to see if they had any money on them at the time they were slaughtered. If so, that money has to be taken from him or her, confiscated by the Muslim, and used to finance to continue the path of blood, the end goal being to convert the entire world to Islam. Don't take my word for it. Let's look at the primary source document. Surah 8, verse 41, quote, "Know that whatever booty you take, the fifth of it is Allah's and the messenger's." In other words, it says that 1/5 or 20% of whatever you take from the people you've robbed, captured, killed, whatever, is supposed to go to the quote-unquote messenger. And we know historically this is something Muhammad spoke about because he did it, because he was the beneficiary. Convenient revelation from Allah. Rob people and give me the cash after you kill them. So how do you think the early Muslims financed themselves? This was before any oil had been discovered in that part of the world, or before anyone knew what to do with oil if they did find it. How did they finance themselves? They robbed, they looted, they burned, they raped whoever would not become a Muslim. Does the Quran leave room open for this to be practiced in today's world is the real question. Well, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, the most popular commentator being read by Muslims in the Western world, seems to think so. If you go to his text translation and commentary of the Quran, page 425, you run into his footnote number 1209, that is to say 1209, where it says, quote, "The rule is that a fifth share is set apart for the Imam," the commander is a parenthetical statement, "and the rest is divided among the forces," close quote. Those are the words of Abdullah Yusuf Ali himself. So once you conquer a certain people, whatever you take, 20% goes to Muhammad's dead, so whoever's in charge, either the Imam if it's a religious leader, or the commander if it's a military leader, the rest is divided among the forces. All right. Since there's not a quote-unquote prophet Muhammad to give 20% to, or 1/5 to, you instead give 1/5 to whoever is leading the band of your soldiers on the killing spree. And notice that all of Ali's verbs in his comments on Surah 841 are in the present tense. That is to say, this act, killing those who will not convert and then robbing their dead bodies in order to confiscate the money to use to finance the spread of Islam, is not some remote, ancient, outdated practice. Muslims seeking to apply the Quran to their lives are to apply it today. Once you are well prepared to carry it out, then you must go ahead in the name of Allah and terrorize any and all non-Muslims. Surah 8, we're continuing on in Surah 8 because we're keeping the flow of the context here. Eventually run into verse 60. Quote, "Make ready for them whatever force and strings of horses you can to terrify thereby the enemy of God and your enemy and others besides them that you know not. God knows them, or Allah knows them. And whatsoever you expend in the way of Allah shall be repaid you in full. You will not be wronged." Close quote. All right, so make ready for them, and them in the context is non-Muslims. Muslims are being trained how to deal with non-Muslims. If you're a non-Muslim, a Muslim who reads this verse is being instructed how to treat you. So make ready for them what? Whatever force, any weapon, or anything that can be used as a weapon against a non-Muslim is the idea here. Now, obviously, airplanes were not invented in Muhammad's day, but they're not excluded either in an interpretation of this passage. So room is left open for airplanes and only God knows what else, far worse. The idea is to prepare whatever you can, whatever can be used as a weapon, and get these things assembled, get them ready to go out for the great cause of advancing Islam, and the strings of horses you can. At the time this was originally quote-unquote revealed, even today in some Muslim countries, horses, camels, and other animals are used as transportation. Same idea, get whatever you can, be it weapons, be it transportation, get ready to use it to, quote, terrify thereby the enemy of God, the enemy of Allah. If you have a Quran, circle that sentence in Surah 8, verse 60. Terrify. Terrify the enemy of God. Enemy of God is a reference to non-Muslims. If you read enough Islamic literature, you'll know that. If this sounds foreign to you, it just means you have an educational deficiency or gap that you need to fill by reading. But I can say this from life experience, that I've been called an enemy of Allah by more than one Muslim from more than one different country because I was unwilling to renounce Christianity and become a Muslim like them. On one internet site, enemy of Allah became my nickname used by Muslims to refer to me for a while. And your enemy. So not just the enemy of Allah, but your enemy. The idea is that any enemy of Allah's is thought to be an enemy of his human followers, his believers, his Muslims, an enemy of theirs. So you ever heard the phrase, any friend of his is a friend of mine? Well, the Muslim's supposed to think any enemy of Allah's is an enemy of mine. So, again, we're dealing with non-Muslims, no matter how you slice it. And others besides them that you know not, Allah knows them. So when you go out in the name of Allah to kill some of his enemies, of which you're unaware even exist, there's a possibility that he'll also use you to hit one of his enemies of which you are unaware. Someone you never met that's a non-Muslim. So it's a nice little bonus, right? Pretty sick if you ask me or any civilized person. And whatsoever you would expend in the way of Allah, interesting to note that killing non-Muslims is literally called the way of Allah, right here in this verse. Any of you who don't think Islam was involved in the attack against America, I hope you're paying attention to the terminology here, shall be repaid to you in full. In other words, for what the Muslim loses on this side of the grave in his killing for Islam, for Allah, he or she will be rewarded on the other side of the grave in Allah's heaven. You will not be wronged. The idea is that the stunt that you're getting set to pull off in the name of Allah for the advancement of Islam is going to go smoothly, and it will not fail no matter what. Even if by earthly standards it looks like a failure, it really wasn't. So it's another illusion of invincibility. It's a delusion of grandeur offered to the Muslim who decides to do this for Allah. So you can imagine the great psychological and emotional condition if somebody literally believes this to be true in an absolute sense, and they're psyching themselves up to do something crazy. The Muslim terrorist who studies this verse right before hijacking a plane or shooting up a mall or whatever has these inspirational words ringing in his head throughout the day, giving him the motivation to do what he has to do for Allah, fully believing that he will be unstoppable. What human being or what human agency can possibly prevent the will of Allah from happening? Since this person believes that he's actually doing God's will, he is energized, he is psyched up in a radical way to get the job done, to do it right. He's trying to please somebody up in the sky. No fear of possible failure even enters the mind. No feelings about potential consequences even enters their heart. Nothing will sway him from his desire to carry it out, and disaster will always be the result. Let us kill in the name of Allah. If we die while doing it, we get to go to heaven. Surah 4, ayat or verse 74 says, quote, so let them fight in the way of Allah who sell the present life for the world to come. And whosoever fights in the way of Allah and is slain or conquers, we shall bring him a mighty wage, close quote. So those who, quote, sell the present life for the world to come, Muslims, particularly Muslims who are prepared to die, who are willing to trade living to an old man in exchange for God, this verse says to, quote, Let them fight in the way of Allah. So once again, the way of Allah is described with fighting terminology. Once again, all right, you should see the flow of this entire book. Any Muslim who obeys this verse and becomes a casualty is promised entrance into the Muslim concept and definition of heaven once again. So this promise of heaven is more than likely what the phrase, "we shall bring him a mighty wage," is referring to in this verse. Anyone who is not a Muslim is not only an enemy of Allah and an enemy of the Muslims, but is a friend of the devil too. If you're a non-Muslim, did you know that the Quran commands your Muslim neighbor to view you as a friend of the devil? Surah 4, we just looked at verse 74, keeping in the same flow of thought. I like to keep things in the context. We get to verse 76, quote, "The believers fight in the way of Allah, and the unbelievers fight in the idol's way. Fight you therefore against the friends of Satan. Surely the guile of Satan is ever feeble," close quote. So again, once again, the way of Allah is described with fighting and violent terminology. You can't get around it. Believers, in a Muslim writing, obviously a believer is a Muslim. Muslims fight in the way of Allah. It means they kill for Allah's cause, which, as we know, is the advancement of the religious idea of submission to Him, which is a religion called Islam, by every single human being on the earth. The unbelievers and the friends of Satan are the non-Muslims. Muslims are supposed to fight against and kill them whenever, wherever, and however they can. If the opportunity presents itself, if there's a lack of vigilance, if the door is open, go for it with all gusto. Back to the original charges. Do you remember reading the early part of this chapter of my book? My original charges against Islam still remain. I still charge Islam with being a violent religion and commanding its believers to commit acts of violence against people of other religious worldviews. And I charge it with having been the motivational factor which guided and inspired along the September 11th, 2001 attack against America. I've put forth proof. I've put forth proof from not only the primary source reference works against which, or inside of which this religion has been defined and systematized, that it wrote itself, but I also went to its scholars for the interpretation from an Islamic vantage point. What have you thought of this case? By reading this book, you've not been given a thorough, you've not been given a scholarly look at violence and its relationship to terrorism via Islam. You've merely been given a brief introduction at best. Much more could be said about it. I could write a ton more, and I could blast you with so much information that you'd probably be stuck looking at a book many inches thick. Probably several volumes if you want to know the truth. But this isn't necessary for you to get the point. I hope at least that you have begun to see the point, that you've actually begun to see the thesis and the ultimate message of this book. I hope that you've been informed that even though everywhere you look, you see someone telling you that Islam is peaceful, that anyone who asks any questions of it is an Islamophobe and a hater, another view actually exists out there in the world, independent of the television and Hollywood and your local school and the university and whoever else has tried to put this on you. I hope you've even possibly been convinced that this other view that exists out there is actually the truth when you weigh the evidence and a reasonable interpretation of it. And I hope that you will conform your view of Islam to match this evidence and this truthful view, because your life and that of your country and that of your family depend on it. And I hope you will communicate this new view that you've just adopted through this book of Islam with your family, with your friends, with your neighbors, your schoolmates, your co-workers, and anybody who will give you the time of day. And I'm able to cite the Muslim quote-unquote scriptures from the Quran that come out and teach Muslims to kill non-Muslims for the greater cause of advancing Islam across the planet. The people on TV who want you to see Islam as peaceful can quote from nothing, no Quran, no Hadith, to defend their position. They just want to say it and